It started on an ordinary day, the kind of day where you don't expect anything remarkable to happen, and maybe that's why it had such an impact. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee, half listening to the hum of the refrigerator and half staring at the wall, the kind of blank stare you get when your mind is tangled in worries. My life had settled into a dull rhythm, predictable and uninspired, and deep down I knew I was stuck. Bills piled up, dreams that once felt urgent now seemed childish, and every morning felt like a reluctant replay of the one before. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic sense, but I wasn't living either. I was simply enduring. That morning, however, I came across something strange. My neighbor had left a small booklet on my doorstep, the kind of thing you'd normally throw away without even glancing at it. It wasn't flashy, just plain white with bold black letters on the front that read, "The trick that will change everything." I almost laughed at it, certain it was some scam or cheap self-help nonsense, but something about its blunt simplicity made me curious. I brought it inside, opened it, and found only a single page inside. The page had no long explanations, no complicated theories, just one instruction written in clear handwriting. For the next 30 days, whenever you are faced with a choice, even the smallest one, pause for 5 seconds. Count them slowly. Then do the thing that feels hardest but truest. It didn't make much sense at first. Hardest but truest? Who was I to judge what that meant? But I decided to humor the idea, if only because I had nothing else to lose. That evening, when I came home from work drained and ready to collapse on the couch, I stood there with the remote in my hand. I remembered the words, counted 5 slow seconds, and instead of sinking into the same old habit, I picked up the notebook I hadn't touched in months. I started writing again, just a few sentences, but for the first time in a long while I felt awake. The next day, I tried it again. At lunch, instead of scrolling on my phone in silence, I forced myself to strike up a conversation with a colleague I usually avoided. It was awkward, but as we talked, I discovered she was struggling with some of the same doubts I carried. That single conversation lit a spark of connection I didn't realize I needed. Day after day, the trick reshaped me in small ways. 5 seconds before choosing meant I couldn't act on autopilot. When I wanted to ignore an email because it made me uncomfortable, I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then replied honestly. When I hesitated to apply for a job I secretly wanted, I counted and hit send. When my brother called late one night and I wanted to let it ring, I counted and picked up. That call led to a raw, overdue conversation that healed a wound between us I thought would never close. By the 10th day, the trick had become less about choices and more about peeling back layers of fear I hadn't realized were directing my life. I noticed how often I defaulted to the easiest option, the path of least resistance. The trick didn't promise comfort. It promised truth, and truth often hurt. It meant saying no when I wanted to avoid conflict, saying yes when I wanted to hide. It meant admitting things to myself I had buried for years. On the 20th day, something extraordinary happened. I received a call from a small publisher I had once sent a draft to years ago, before giving up on myself. They had stumbled across my old manuscript and wanted to talk about it. The old me would have panicked, doubted, delayed, but the 5 seconds changed everything. I counted, breathed, and said yes. By the 30th day, I didn't need the booklet anymore. The trick had worked its way into me so deeply that hesitation no longer ruled me. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some secret formula hidden from the world. It was a simple pause, a gap wide enough to let courage slip in before fear slammed the door shut. I never saw my neighbor again, the one who left the booklet. I don't know who wrote it or why it landed at my door. But I know this. The unbelievable trick wasn't about changing the world around me. It was about changing the way I stepped into it. And that has made all the difference. The first week was clumsy. I didn't always remember to count, and when I did, the choices often felt too small to matter. Should I walk to work instead of taking the bus? Should I cook instead of ordering takeout? Should I call my mother instead of pretending I was too busy? Most of the time, The harder but truer thing was the one I had been avoiding, and it almost felt laughable how predictable my comfort-seeking had become. On the seventh day, I faced my first real test. My manager asked if anyone wanted to take on a presentation for a new client. Normally, I would shrink back, eyes glued to the floor, praying someone else would volunteer. My chest tightened, my palms grew damp, and I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. But then the words came back. Pause, count 5 seconds, choose the hardest but truest thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I lifted my head and said, "I'll do it," the room fell silent, and even my manager looked surprised. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to snatch the words back. But it was too late. They were out, and I was committed. That night, I stayed up until dawn preparing. It wasn't perfect when I delivered it, but it was honest, it was me, and for the first time, I felt seen at work. By the second week, I started noticing changes outside myself. People responded differently. My colleague who used to ignore me now waved at me in the mornings. The barista at the coffee shop asked how my writing was going because I had, for once, mentioned it. Even strangers seemed warmer. It was as though the trick wasn't just shifting me, it was bending the world around me too. The 15th day brought something unexpected. I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend I had hurt with careless words in my 20s. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I never saw it. But again, the count began. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I replied with honesty, admitting the mistakes I had buried. That night, we spoke for hours, and though we couldn't reclaim the lost years, we built a fragile bridge across them. The third week was harder. The trick demanded more than I thought I could give. It asked me to confront truths I'd spent years running from. On the 19th day, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, counting slowly, and admitting out loud that I was deeply unhappy in my relationship. I had been clinging to it out of fear of being alone. The truest thing was not to stay, not to force comfort, but to let go. Saying the words broke me open, but it was the most honest breath I had taken in years. By the 25th day, I was almost unrecognizable. Not because my life had suddenly become flawless, far from it, but because I had stopped living half asleep. When opportunities appeared, I leaned toward them instead of shrinking away. When conflict arose, I faced it instead of dodging it. And with every small decision, the distance between who I was and who I wanted to be grew smaller. Then came the 30th day, and with it, the call that changed everything. The publisher wanted to meet, not just to talk, but to offer me a chance to finish and refine my manuscript. The younger version of me, the one who had buried his dreams under self-doubt and routine, would have said no, would have convinced himself it wasn't worth it. But after 30 days of counting, of choosing what was hardest but truest, the answer came easily. Yes. It has been months since then, and I no longer count aloud. The pause lives inside me now, woven into every choice. The unbelievable trick was never about magic, never about shortcuts. It was about creating space in my life, space wide enough for courage to take root. And sometimes, late at night, when I look at the worn booklet still tucked in my drawer, I wonder why it came to me, and what would have happened if I had thrown it away. Maybe it was chance, maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the universe's way of handing me back the pen I had dropped. All I know is this. One page, one sentence, one small pause, 5 seconds, changed the story of my life forever.